there has been shifts within the United States. We have seen Congress people who are now taking bold steps. Right now, there's a bill, HR 2590, which really is just saying that it refuses to give the state of Israel money as long as it targets children. There should be no black and white, or it's so clear. There should be no gray area around it. It's stop funding the harm of children.
BDS is one of the strongest tools today for pressing the Israeli occupation power to end its occupation of the Palestinian land. BDS activities are expanding to include not only the economic sphere, but also the cultural, academic, and the sport spheres. Activists are employing everything they have to make BDS more effective worldwide. Poetry and art are among the domains used to that end. And to see how helpful such activities are, we have the Palestinian American poet Sharif Zakut from California in the United States to talk about that. It's nice to have you on our program, Mr. Sharif.
Thank you for having me.
We are going to talk about poetry and the role of poetry and art in strengthening the concept of justice and PDS against the Israeli colonial regime. But first, I want to ask you about the status of the BDS in the United States now, as it is considered one of the best and the strongest weapons the Palestinian people have these days. What is your view of its status and its power now in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. BDS is one of the few tools that we have as Palestinians living outside of the region to directly impact the ways in which Israel is funded. But also beyond that, as you mentioned, it's also a cultural and academic boycott as well. And BDS is really the lowest bar that we can set in being able to show our support for Palestine. It's refusing to engage with product or goods or cultural pieces or academic pieces that relate to and profit and that relate to the state of Israel, where the state of Israel profits from those things. And so we have a role to play in the United States where we should be aware of what we consume.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Sharif, we all heard about the Block the Boat campaign and how it succeeded in Auckland port and also in South Africa, in Italy and other countries. So tell me, how can you as activists build on its success in Auckland port and South Africa? How can you build on that, okay, and expand this campaign to include other countries around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the successes of this campaign was our ability to build power with workers. And not just for blocking the boat one time, but years of work. We actually started Block the Boat first in 2010, and then 2014 was actually when we were successful in Oakland. And that was only possible because of the relationships that we built here with our local workers who actually unload the ship. And so for other port cities around the world, we've seen a lot of inspiration from Oakland and wanting to actually be able to block boats all over in different port cities internationally. That really is a huge economic impact on the state of Israel. It's stopping international commerce. And so for us, we recognize that we're in this for the long haul. And if we want to be able to organize in different port cities, every port city has its own different, has its own different conditions, has its own different legacy of workers. And so for us, we really want to understand Block the Boat as being both an effort led by community and by the workers to build long-term solidarity for Palestine.
Yes, but Mr. Sharif, don't you see that the Israeli diplomacy is penetrating many countries these days? And we heard how it entered the African Union as an observer member of the Union. So as BDS activists, how do you feel when you see such steps by the Israeli occupation government and such it is a political achievement as it can get such status in Africa and in other areas in the world, including some Arab countries, like the normalization agreements held with some Arab countries during the past 2 years?
Yeah. Normalization is absolutely a problem, but I think also while this is happening simultaneously, we see even in the United States where BDS is being criminalized, where we see that the Israeli and Zionist forces have really been pushing harder than they ever have before. And for us, that's an indication that Israeli hegemony is cracking. And so even though they are making these political gains, we're also seeing people in the Olympics refusing to spar with Israelis on the an international stage. We're also seeing BDS wins with Ben and Jerry's. We're seeing BDS wins all over the world with Block the Boat. And so this is them getting desperate, but also this is also how unfortunately power works, where they're going to try to consolidate it and build it where they can.
Yeah, and when we talk about BDS, we talk about economic and commercial boycott of the Israeli colonial regime. But at the same time, the academic boycott is very important, and you organize poetic eves, and as we saw, the long nights of poets. How these activities contribute to strengthening BDS at the academic level and other levels too?
Yeah, well, art and culture is very important for building consciousness and also for building long-term solidarity. We're only here where we are in the United States with BDS because of the years and years of work done by cultural workers, organizers, activists. And so what we're seeing now is a shift in the tide when it comes to just how the general consciousness understands Israel and no longer can just stand by its actions when it continues to employ such a brutal occupation in our people. And so for us, really, art and culture is a tool and is a weapon to be able to uplift our stories and share our histories and also link our struggles, because art and culture really bring all of us who are fighting repression together.
Yeah, we are all watching the Olympic Games in Tokyo these days, and we saw how the Algerian and also the Sudanese players, Olympians, boycotted the games because they don't want to compete with the Israeli player. So, how do you see such progress in the work of the BDS at the level of sport?
Yeah, I'm not much of a sports fan like that, but I think it's also just very touching to see that level of solidarity. I saw one of the athletes say that, he worked very hard to get to where he was, but he saw the issue of Palestine as being bigger than himself. And I think that type of solidarity is not only moving, but just embodies what true solidarity is, and being able not just to stand with the Palestinian cause, but to really, he worked hard and he had to take a step back. And so
Sure.
I think that's really important to see all across levels. And we've seen similar things also for other struggles. I live in San Francisco, where Colin Kaepernick started the Kneel for Black Lives Matter, and that created a whole political divide. And so we're seeing more and more athletes stepping up for social justice and racial justice, which I think is an important intervention.
Yeah. And Mr. Sharif, I want you as an activist and as a poet now. When the Israeli occupation government has warned the Palestinian citizens of Sheikh Jarrah that it would evict or expel them from their houses next Saturday. So, as a poet, when you hear of such a threat by Israel to citizens who are expected to live safely in their houses in Sheikh Jarrah and elsewhere in Jerusalem and Palestine, what do you say to the activists and to all the people who support justice for Palestine and for all peoples on this planet?
Yeah, I would say that things take time and we need to keep working. As I mentioned before, we have a role, especially as someone who lives within the United States, that plays a very particular role in the ways it funds all of this displacement and horror happening in Sheikh Jarrah and all over Palestine. So as a poet, it's important that I use my voice in the rallies that I go to, in the events, in my community, being able to uplift what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah from right here in the Bay Area. And so we are all a part of this global anti-Zionist movement, this global movement to free Palestine. As a poet here in San Francisco, I want us to be, even if we are a small part of this larger movement, I want us to be the strongest part there is. And so We understand that struggle, we're in it for the long haul. And we're going to keep fighting until we see justice, not just in Palestine, but for all our peoples globally.
Yes, and my final question to you, Mr. Sharif, concerning the campaign calling on the Speaker of the American Congress, Pelosi, to take action against the Israeli settlements. We know that the Zionist lobby is very strong in the United States, but to what extent do you think the Palestinian voice and the supporters of justice for Palestine can affect the American Congress and the American foreign policy in general when it comes to the Palestinian cause?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that question. I live in Pelosi's district, so of course this is a really important issue. And I think there has been shifts within the United States. We have seen Congress people who are now taking bold steps. Right now, there's a bill, HR 2590, which really is just saying that it refuses to give the state of Israel money as long as it targets children. There should be no black and white, or it's so clear. There should be no gray area around it. It's stop funding the harm of children. And so we are seeing huge shift within our legislation, within Congress. But we also see that Zionists are getting desperate. And so they are pushing, smearing, attacking candidates wherever they can. And also they are trying to co-opt a lot of, especially the Democratic Party and racial justice issues, trying to portray themselves as progressive, where we know that's not the case. And so for our Democratic leadership, and really for all of our leadership here, we need them to step up because this is long overdue. But as long as we continue to fight here, we're going to continue putting pressure on Congress people.
Yeah, Sharif Zakout, Palestinian American poet and activist, thank you very much. And it has been great honor to have you on our program. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for watching. And from you, Osama Nazal, goodbye.